And welcome, a warm welcome to St Giles on this, the second of our talks. Can you all hear me? Nobody, well, you wouldn't be able to answer, I suppose, if you didn't hear it. Anyhow, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dom Stephen Ortiger from Worth Abbey, one-time Abbot of Worth, and also to our fellow brethren at St Benet's house. Can you hear me now? Yeah. There are two of us two people from St Benet's, and there's also two brothers from Abbot. So we're very blessed to have a goodly number of Benedictines amongst us. Without any further ado, I will introduce Dom Stephen, who's going to talk on holy listening, the sound of silence.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I hope I can be of some service to you. As Georgie says, I'm Father Stephen from Worth Abbey. If you don't know where that is, it's about 5 miles as the crow flies from Gatwick, but please don't think that it's the end of the runway. It manifestly isn't. It's in lovely Sussex countryside, 500 acres of lovely Sussex countryside, and I've been a monk there for 51 years. And we were founded by Downside, which some of you may know, which is between Bath and Wells. And I suggested to Georgie that perhaps we could call this holy listening the sound of silence, because I do feel very strongly that what St Benedict has to offer is of great relevance to people in Civvy Street like yourselves, in fact to all of us. And time-wise, what I'd like to do is to talk perhaps for half an hour, 35 minutes, and then leave an opportunity for people to ask questions. If I go fairly rapidly over certain points, it's not because those points are unimportant, it's because I'm trying to cover the ground in the time allotted. So, to start, first of all, I want to say here in my hand is the Rule of St Benedict, an extremely slim volume, about 12,000 words. And it has to be one of the most influential documents in the history of Christian spirituality. Richard Southern said he felt it was the second most influential. Obviously the most influential is the Word of God, Holy Scripture. But this is the document by which thousands and thousands of people have lived and do live. And it has been a way for them of following Christ. Now, very important to say that this is not the fifth gospel. It is not the fifth gospel. I say that because at the moment St Benedict is something of a hot property, and people are writing endlessly about St Benedict, almost to the exclusion of Jesus Christ. St Benedict would be horrified. This is not the fifth gospel. What he's done, he's downloaded, this is our language, he's downloaded the gospel for people who wish to follow Christ in a community setting. Because you don't have to know very much about monks to be aware that monks are people who they stay rooted, they stay in one monastery. And St Benedict wants them to do that because he feels that if you're stable, and he invented the vow of stability, that gives you an opportunity to make the really important journey, which is the journey to the centre. So if you're geographically still, you can make the journey to the centre. That's the most important journey. If you keep moving, you can't make that all-important journey. So, he's downloading the gospel for people who wish to find Christ in a community setting. Now, St Benedict, born perhaps 480, died perhaps 547. He's actually quite late in monastic history. Plenty of monks before him. So he needs to be placed within the monastic context. Now, all those people before St Benedict himself and after, they were vividly aware of the God who made himself incarnate. This is the key doctrine, the incarnate God. Now, Buddhists would not go for that, Muslims would not go for that, Jews would not go for that. We say God became incarnate. Once you have an incarnate God, all sorts of things flow. And for St. Benedict and the whole monastic tradition, spirituality is very, very, very incarnate. So it's not a question of looking into the sky and wondering where God is. God is absolutely there, tangibly, audibly. Now, that means for St. Benedict and the monastics that God is always, always speaking in a way which is accessible, always. For those people, it would be unthinkable that there should be a God who was not communicating. Jesus Christ is the communication of God, but incarnation is not just December the 25th, which it wasn't, 4 AD, which it wasn't. It's every single day, every single day. And if you look in the Rule of St. Benedict, it's very, very earthy. One of his favourite texts is Matthew 25, which is about sheep and goats. Whatever you did to one of these, you did to me. If you want to find Christ, well, he is going to be in the abbot. He is going to be in the guest. He is going to be in the young. He is going to be in the sick. He is going to be in the person who comes to your monastery and criticizes something. That's where you're going to find Christ. So that is God communicating with us. That means that for St. Benedict, the most important thing that Christians can do, and therefore monks, is always to be listening. That is the major item on the agenda. The very first word in this document is listen. Ausculta, o fili, listen, my son, listen, listen. And the whole rule is shot through with a belief that listening is the very most important thing that we can all do. That's where it starts. Just little examples. He says, supposing there is some important matter that needs to be treated in the monastery, what is the procedure to follow? And he says, this is the procedure. This is on calling the brethren to council. He says, the abbot ought to call everybody together, and he should then set forth the matter, and then he should listen to what everybody has to say, and then he should go and mull and pray, and then himself, because he's the abbot, reach a decision. St. Benedict stops himself and says, the reason why we have said that everybody must be called to council is because God often reveals what is better to the younger, which is an extraordinary thing to say, certainly in the 6th century. God often reveals what is better to the younger. We had a wonderful Father, Oliver, prayed, who said, I've never known that to happen. But notice where St. Benedict is coming from. He's saying, if the abbot listens, then what he's going to do, notice the phrase, God reveals what is better to the younger. If the abbot listens to all these people who are sitting in this room on these chairs, etc., he will hear what they have to say, but his perception is he will hear what God has to say. God is speaking through the community, and that means God is speaking through every single member of the community. So this is not just a management device, it's cashing in the theology, it's cashing in the spirituality. God speaking to us through each other, and then the abbot takes that away, and he ponders it, he mulls it, and then the abbot, he makes a decision. Or take another example, thing I referred to. What happens if somebody comes along and makes a criticism? St. Benedict says it can happen that somebody might visit and might reasonably and pleasantly point to some defect. And St. Benedict says, if that happens, or when that happens, the abbot should take special care, because, here goes the reason, because God may have sent that person for that very reason. The idea that God is speaking to the abbot, the community, in this person who is making some sort of criticism. St. Benedict says, on no account should one shoot the messenger. Absolutely not. And for him, the world is full of messengers. Or if you want to be biblical about it, the world is full of angels. They are bearing a message. They are making God present. So, if that is the case, then the monastic enterprise becomes primarily one of listening. And just a little thing, little stage direction, if you like, from St. Benedict. He's got quite a few chapters on how the psalmody ought to be distributed through the various hours of the day and the week and this, that and the other. Now, he always wants the night office to start with Psalm 94, that's in Roman Catholic speak. I think it's 95 for the Anglicans. Which, because it contains the lines, "Oh, that today you would listen to his voice. Harden not your hearts." That's what St. Benedict wants to strike the eardrums of his monks. First thing every day. It would have been in his day at about 2 o'clock in the morning, 2:30, whatever. Oh, that today you would listen to his voice. Never mind yesterday, and never mind tomorrow. Today, today, today. God is actually saying something to you. We just need to take that on board. So, the whole of the rule, we could spend a long time talking about his belief that God is incarnate. There he is. He's actually impinging in a very concrete way on our lives, and he's always speaking to us. Now, if he's always speaking, then, of course, that's when we do our listening. So, we need to have an attitude, St. Benedict says, of it's the Samuel Lord. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Not, listen, Lord, your servant is speaking. Not that way around. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And just to anticipate something, what is the relationship of listening to praying? Well, it's two sides of a coin, that's what it is. But for St. Benedict, it's what we were taught perhaps in the nursery. Speak when you're spoken to. Speak when you're spoken to. Allow God to speak, and then we can respond, because we've heard something. Now, because listening is so important, this is where silence comes in. Silence in itself, just like to suggest, is neither here nor there. Silence as a means to an end, and the end being listening, is crucially important. But it is about listening, it's not about silence. So I don't want you to leave the church today thinking, I must go home and try to be as silent as possible. I'd love you to go to the church saying, I must try to listen better. Also, I need to tell you, by the way, that you can be very silent and do no listening whatever. This is entirely possible. And in monasteries, things are arranged so that we have times and places of silence. Well, I could be in a time and place of silence, and nothing could be happening in my head. Nothing at all. Of course, I look the part because I'm dressed in a long black dress, but nothing's happening. For St. Benedict, it's a complete waste of time, because we must keep making the journey. Now, this thing about, if you like, so what is silence? Silence is turning a volume down, at least, and perhaps excluding sound altogether, so that I can attend. Little example of this, I met somebody in a pub in Surrey because I wanted to meet this person to have a particular conversation, a very important conversation with this person, and we found this nice little pub, went in there. To my horror, inevitably the wretched Muzak was playing. And they had organised the speakers so it was virtually impossible to find a nook or cranny in this pub which was beyond the range of the Muzak. So we went to the least worst place, but even then it was very difficult to have the quality of conversation which I felt was absolutely imperative. And I said to, I think it was the guy, I said, is there any chance of turning this thing down, or ideally turning it off? And she looked startled. I said, the reason I'm asking you to do this thing is because I've come here to have this conversation with this person. He needs to be able to hear what I'm saying, and I need to be able to hear what he's saying. But I can't do that easily, and he can't do that easily with this going on. And I'm delighted with your pub, and the food is lovely, but I'm not a lip reader. So is there any way, ideally, to turn this thing off? That, I think, says the whole thing, because if we want to attend to something, we do need to exclude certain other things. But the object of the exercise is to attend better, So a monastery, if it has times and places of silence, this is precisely to create an atmosphere in which it becomes easier to attend. As I said, it doesn't necessarily follow, because you could be in the time, place of silence and not attend, but it makes it easier to have that attentive. And what does St. Benedict want us to be attending to? Well, God speaking, and he would say, in all sorts of ways. There's a complete range, there's a total spectrum of ways in which God is speaking to us. I think that sadly we may have, I'm not saying we would articulate this, we wouldn't, because it's nonsense, but we might carry it in our heart. I think we may have a belief that actually God doesn't say anything much, or not now, or not to me. Jesus speaking, fine. But Jesus, long ago, far away. Does God speak to me here and now? We might have some difficulty with that. Do I really, from my toenails upwards, believe that? Well, for St. Benedict, that is precisely what we ought to be believing. For this reason, you have a God who's incarnate, and you also have a God who's loving. How could an incarnate God not impinge? That's what incarnation is about, impinging, you use that word, and how could a loving God not communicate? If you walk around, you see zillions of people. Well, I spend part of my time with young people in our school, because I'm chaplain to the girls who are boarders, and of course all young people spend a lot of time on mobile phones, and then they're texting and they're doing this, that, and the other. They're communicating endlessly, and sometimes we poke fun and say, they can't stop. They seem to be addicted to texting and phoning. They only spoke to each other 4 minutes ago. What's the need to go on communicating? But I think that it's rather lovely that people actually want to communicate. What is the alternative? People not wanting to communicate. They communicate because she's my friend, he's my friend, they're my friends, all of this. I know it's open to abuse, all of that, I know that, but the instinct to communicate is profound. We communicate with those whom we love. Now, if we start to say, as we always do, that God is a God who loves, then it is unthinkable. It is unthinkable that God would not communicate with us. It's unthinkable. That's a contradiction in terms. In Scripture, very often the Jews will poke fun at the people down the road who believe in all sorts of gods, or they call them gods, but the psalmist would say, well, they have eyes and they can't see, and they have mouths and they can't speak, and they have ears. They're just useless. One of the things is they have mouths, but they can't say anything. That is a sign of a false god. Whereas the psalmist would say, our God, of course, is alive and well and does all the things that you would expect from an alive and well person. Now that belief we need to bring down here. I don't know if any of you have read a book called The Shack. Somebody read it? If you haven't read it, some people don't like it, many people do like it. Just very briefly, for those of you who haven't read it, it's a story about, I think it's set in Canada, North America, about a man, he's married, he's got children, one of his children. It starts horribly, really. I mean, she is abducted and done to death. So it's a very, very grisly beginning. Of course, he is beside himself with grief, beside himself. And then one day he receives a letter from God inviting him to go to the place where his daughter was done to death, which is a shack, a shed. And then he goes to the shack or the shed, and the rest of the book, if you like, it's a modern version of the book of Job, where he meets God, and there's a huge discussion about how is it conceivable that such hideous things can happen if there is a God who is almighty, all-powerful, and so on. Actually, I think it's quite a clever book. But the reason I'm telling you this is because from the reader's point of view, when the reader gets to the point where the letter appears in the letterbox, then the reader may have a double problem. The reader, you and I, may have a double problem. First problem is, we may think, well, this is silly now, because God does not send letters which appear in letterboxes. So I thought this was going to be a serious book. In fact, it's some sort of silly thing, so I can't be doing that. I'll read some. So that can be the first thing. Some people would have a problem with willingly suspending the disbelief and just getting on with the book. But there's a much deeper problem, and that is the issue of, in my heart of hearts, in my heart of hearts, I can find it very difficult to think that God would actually speak to me, whether it's by letter or text or carrier pigeon or any blessed thing. Why would he speak to me? Because this hooks into a primal fear that I am too insignificant to be worthy of God's attention. That is, I think, a primal fear. If you watch those programs by Brian Cox on the universe, I think, my word, this is a huge universe. I thought it was big and hadn't even begun to think how big it is. And you think, well, where do I fit in with that? Where does the whole human race fit in with that? We're talking about some tiny, tiny, tiny speck of dust in this vastness. So it wouldn't be surprising if we thought, well, I don't think I'm very significant, because I am not very significant from one point of view. I'm very insignificant. And Brian Cox makes it very clear how insignificant we are. And even if I am a speck of dust, then I think, well, even in the Guinness Book of Specks of Dust, I'm not much cop as a speck of dust. So why would any sane God wish to speak to me? The New Testament is full of people who got out of bed every morning fully expecting that no sane person would wish to speak to them that day. Like tax collectors and prostitutes and lepers and Samaritans and pagans and Uncle Tom Cobling all, they would expect on a daily basis to be told, get lost, drop dead, shove off. And the very fact that Jesus of Nazareth stopped to say anything would have been remarkable. Remarkable. And they are we are they. They are every man, they are every woman. They represent this terrible fear we all carry that we're not worth talking to, and certainly not worth loving. And that is true even in human relationships. If somebody says, or if somebody said one time in our life, I love you, the knee-jerk reaction could have been, you've got to be mistaken. It must be somebody else you have in mind, or you wouldn't if you knew what I was really like. In other words, we're downloading this fear we have of not being worth talking to. But what the teaching of Christianity is that amazingly, and okay Brian Cox and okay all these people, God wishes to pitch his tent not just with men, women, but delights in an interaction with me, with me, with me, with me. And is always saying something to me. That is quite difficult to believe. This is why the old thing, the longest journey is from the heart to the head to the heart. The longest journey, actually believing it. Once one believes that, then one is going to think, good grief, well, this God is on a daily basis communicating. Go back to the Rosenberg, he's saying, how's that going to happen? Through various people, which is why he says, you've got to see Christ in the abbot and the sick and the young and this, that and the other. He's always there, always there, always there. But for St. Benedict also, in events, God is speaking through some event. God is speaking to me through myself. The whole business of listening to oneself is, it's a very necessary thing to do. I know some people who are physiotherapists, and I remember being very struck by what one of them in particular said. She said, there are some things that I find it very difficult to deal with. She said, if a person is full of guilt and full of hatred, I can't treat them because it's actually a spiritual thing there. And what their body should be saying to them is, it's not because my back hurts, it's because my heart is full of some very, very difficult emotion. Very difficult. Which she was picking up. And she would also say, but I think it's standard stuff, she's saying, stress, a thing like stress, can make a beeline for various bits of your body. One is up here in the shoulders, and the other is the small of the back. So your body could be telling you something actually really quite important. But for all sorts of reasons, not least because we're English and the show must go on and the lip must be stiff, we press on regardless, not actually listening to what our bodies are saying to us. I think men are especially bad at this, but still. Anyway, St. Benedict would say, God is speaking through those people, through yourself, through your heart, through what's all of this. And he would also, of course, say, God is speaking in that exercise which he puts right at the centre of his rule, and which I think we're going to be talking about later, in the whole business of Lectio Divina, this sacred reading. Now, a quick thing about sacred reading, it was the staple of monks. And then, I don't quite know how this happened historically, it seemed to vanish from view, and it reappeared within the last 30 years, 40 years. It's now become the in thing. The in thing. But in fact, it's a rediscovery. It's a wonderful rediscovery. But it is a rediscovery. What St. Benedict did, the way he organised his day, he said, we're going to spend 4 hours a day in Lectio Divina. 4 hours, that's a huge allocation of time. But he said, this is what we're going to do because God, who speaks in all these other ways, is certainly speaking to us through the scriptures. Certainly, certainly. And for him, I suppose in theological terms, Roman Catholics tend to talk about the real presence, meaning the Eucharist. T-H-E, the real presence. For St. Benedict, there were many real presences. Christ is really, really present in the abbot, the guest, the this, that, and the other. But he's really present in the Word of God. And he would say, this is what we need to do. We need to sit with these texts and let them speak to us. Let them speak to us. And I put it like that because he thinks of this being very much on the receiving end first. I've sometimes had the wonderfully challenging but exhilarating experience of having reflexology. I don't know if you've had reflexology. It's where you lie on your back and somebody works on your feet. It's a very peculiar sensation because if you're used to being the subject of the sentence, I'm going to drive the car, I'm going to fly the plane, I'm going to take the picture, then to lie down and allow somebody else to do something to you is quite a turn-up for the books. It brought home to me that scriptural phrase, be it done unto me. Be it done unto me, according to thy word. Be it done, having things done unto one. Lectio, that's the dynamic of Lectio. The word is actually impinging on me, impinging. Why I'm bringing this to your attention is because not only is Lectio a hugely wonderful rediscovery for monks, but I think it should be a hugely wonderful rediscovery for people in City Street like your good selves. Because just think about it. If I as a clergyman stand up and say, let's all get holier, so what I want you to do, folks, is to pray more, then immediately you're going to think, pray more. Okay, pray more. Sounds grand. Pray more. When will I pray more? Will I get up earlier? I have trouble in getting up. I would have even more trouble getting up earlier. Will I find time during the day? I'm extremely busy during the day. Will I stay up an hour later at night? I'm knackered. When will I do this thing? This clergyman is saying all these good things, but I don't think I can do that because what's happening, you're already doing 455 million things. This will now be 455 million plus one. You will not feel good. You will not feel good. And you will say, this is too much, I can't do that. Nice idea. Shame about the reality. Lectio Divina says, don't start there, just don't start there. Allow something to be done to you because the association we make with reading is a pleasant association. You see people, whether it's a book or whether it's Kindle, they're doing something which they enjoy doing. There they are on the tube or the bus or the plane or the something, and they're doing something and they are, my mother would say, lost in a book. And you think, gosh, this is a really great book. I'm energized by this thing. It's got all those connotations of doing something pleasurable rather than something in the ordeal category, arduous. But the other thing, it's not just pleasant, it's also something which cashes in our belief that God is saying something to me. Typically, a person might sit with, let's say, the Mass readings. I'm talking from a Roman Catholic point of view. The Mass readings tend to be quite short. By the way, short is important because we have a terrible tendency to want to know how the thing ends. So if you put a text in front of people like you and me, we're going to whiz to the end. Who did it? Who did it? We're going to the end of this Dan Brown. Well, please don't do that, by the way. Or Agatha Christie. We want to get to the end. It's not about getting to the end. It's about getting to the centre. So being quite small. What we do is we circle round, we circle round, we circle round, we circle round, we circle round. And then it begins to glow. It begins to glow. This is not, by the way, a quick fix. I think you're talking minimum 15 minutes. But it's amazing how the thing begins to glow. I'll just give you a little example of using a story that we know terribly well, and that's the story of the Good Samaritan. Just to show you how it might begin to speak. So this is a speeded up version, of course, of Lexia, which is not what I want you to do, but time forces me to compress it. We know this story so well. If we have a look at the at the actors in the story, I think we'll find 7. It was when I last counted. We've got the man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Let's count the brigands, the group, as one person. So, man going down, brigands, priest walking by, Levite walking by, Samaritan being the good chap, donkey, and innkeeper. Well, the donkey is terribly important because if you find a half-dead person in the middle of nowhere and wish to get the half-dead person to the inn, you will not carry them. If you have a donkey, your troubles are over. The donkey is essential. Anyway, that's just, let's hear it for the donkey. These 7 people, when I read this, what can happen? Well, I know what can often happen. I think, okay, I'm the good guy, or I want to be the good guy, I want to be the good Samaritan, so I'm going to whiz out and try and be really nice to lots of people. Or I beat my breast and I think, perhaps I'm the bad guy. But if I linger with it, if I let it speak to me, then all sorts of possibilities emerge. It's a bit like going into a room with 7 different mirrors. And I look and think now, which mirror shows me, or shows me something about me? Which of these 7 mirrors works for me? Because, think about it, if you go down from the man who is mugged by the brigands and is now in the ditch, is it conceivable ever that I am the person in the ditch? Is that a more likely connection? Am I the person in the ditch? If so, how did I get there? Has somebody hurt me quite badly? Or have I actually quite badly hurt myself? So am I not just the person in the ditch, but also my own brigand? Have I been a brigand to myself? Or, another way of harming myself, have I actually walked past myself? Because obviously I can't walk past myself physically, but spiritually and psychologically I can certainly walk past myself, ignore myself, neglect myself. Is that a possibility? And, okay, pushing it forward, then is there anybody, any agent that I have experienced as some form of Samaritan, the unlikely person, because the Samaritan is very unlikely. He's the wrong person. An unlikely person who has actually brought a touch of salvation there. Who is my Samaritan? Where is my donkey? When you start to think like that, all sorts of different possibilities start to occur. And you see, God might be saying something really important. And of course, you can read the story this year, last year, the next year. It can say different things at different times, because although it's the same story in a way, I'm a different person each time. So there's a different message, a different connection. And God could truly be saying to me, please look in this mirror, because you really are fairly beaten up and battered. And God offering one some sort of relief from that, to bring one from a bad place, lying there half dead in the middle of nowhere, to a place of solace and refuge and so on. It can begin to speak to one. Of course, it doesn't just speak to one's head. Because once you start to think, I would say there's no thought without an accompanying emotion. And so Hebrews is completely right. The Word of God is like a two-edged sword, and it just gets into the places where no other whatnot can get. And it can stir up all sorts of feelings. Some of them can be quite difficult feelings of terrible grief or anger or resentment, directed, could be, against God. And then we think, well, what am I going to do with this stuff? What am I going to do with this stuff? But that is precisely where the next stage is. This would take another talk, which we're not going to have today. We bring our reality to God. It's always about bringing our reality to God. So for St. Benedict, the longest chapter in the Rule, chapter 7 on humility, which is about being attached to the humus, meaning the earth, being earthed and centered. Just tell it how it is, just tell it how it is, just tell it how it is. That's the whole monastic thinking. We just tell it how it is. And so that process of Lectio, it is a reality check. And what I do in prayer is to bring my reality to God without editing it. We've got a terrible tendency to edit things. Say, I'll bring the nice bits of my reality, but not these ones. But again, if we go back to the New Testament, Jesus never had a problem with people of whom it could be said, what you see is what you get. He never had a problem with those people. There's a tax collector, there's a prostitute, there's a leper, there's a Samaritan, there's a Roman. Manifestly they are what they are. But people of whom you could say, what you see is not what you get, then big problem. The white sepulchre thing. And always to be real. And of course, that is the perception that's incorporated, let's say, in the 12-step program in AA, where a person would stand up with other people and say, my name is John or Mary, whatever, and I am an alcoholic. The perception that by saying the words, by naming the reality, you then enable all sorts of movement to take place, whereas if you don't name the reality, nothing's going to happen. So, there we go. It's time to stop. What I've tried to say is there's St. Benedict in the monastic tradition downloading the whole doctrine of the incarnation and applying it, saying, incarnate God, impinging, always speaking, what should we do? We should listen. Where will we hear? This person, that person, the other person, in Lectio Divina, and so on. And here's the last thing I'm going to say. Once we acquire a listening heart, we don't need the physical silence so much. I referred to Brian Cox, but another person I love is David Attenborough. And you see these wonderful programs, and I think with great affection, particularly of the emperor penguins in Antarctica. There they all are. I don't know how many penguins there are, but zillions it seems to be, and they're all making their penguin noises. And what stuns me, and I think stuns everybody, is how a mother penguin, with all that racket going on, can recognize its chick. How does the penguin do that? I don't know. I really have no idea. But we can learn a great deal from the penguin, because if we have an attentive heart, then even if there's a racket going on, we can hear what God is saying. We can read between the lines. We can hear in the interstices, because our heart is listening. We have a listening heart. Of course, silence is really helpful, but just to say it again, the silence is intended to develop a heart which is always on the qui-vive for God, always, always. And seeing him here, hearing him there, and responding accordingly. So that's what I mean by the sound of silence, not the inside of a paper bag, incredibly dull, but a silence which is pregnant, which is full, which is eloquent. The sound, it has a sound. This is holy listening. God is speaking to me because he loves me, because he wants to say something loving, and if I pick that up, I can then respond accordingly. So, end of that. We've got about 20 minutes if you'd like to fire things back at me. Thank you very much for listening.
If you'd like to ask a question, please do wait until I come around to the microphone so other people can hear your question. Are there any questions? you a question. Were you listening? There's a buzz of saying yes.
If you're trying to get in and you're listening, how do you discern whether it's my voice or God's voice?
I'll switch this device on again in case it's required by the recording. The question was, if you're listening, how do you discern whether something is your voice or God's voice? Excellent, splendid question. This is a very ancient chestnut, this one, and it's so important. And St. Benedict was vividly aware that there can be, you always get a temptation is going to look like an inspiration. So how do you spot the difference? And he would say that the most surefire way of doing it, and this is well in the monastic tradition, is always to run it past somebody else. Always, because if we don't do that, then we can go into a spiral within ourselves. But he would say, you cannot clap with one hand, and you cannot see the back of your own head, and therefore, always, always, always run it past somebody else. He was very aware of some people called the desert fathers, and indeed the desert mothers who lived in unlikely places called deserts, and set a lot of store by being solitary. But these people who set so much store by being solitary also said, you must never be solitary by yourself. What they meant was, you must be solitary, but every now and again you must touch base with somebody else to run past that person, that Abba or Amma, your reality, so that you can actually see what is what. So if you transpose this into our own time, this is where what we would like call a spiritual director is very important. Somebody who's walking beside, with whom I share my reality. And among other things, I will then get a sense of, I'll be able to do a sifting and get an idea whether this is from God or from somewhere else. A spiritual director is somebody who is, that you choose. It's slightly on a professional basis, but of course there is another type of companion called a friend. In Christian spirituality, the whole business of friendship is absolutely key. The person who is your second self, who can actually help you, not to do your work for you, it's not that, but who can help you to do your work. But we do need this business of bouncing things off other people, because we do know very well that it can seem a really good idea. But if we don't run it past somebody else, then we can then fool ourselves. So the short answer is, I think that there's a cat's cradle of things. We need to think, because God's given us excellent brains. We need to pray. We need to talk. And then we need to go around the course again. Think, talk, pray. Think, talk, pray. What do we end up with? We end up with what I'm going to call a holy hunch. By which I mean we don't have 100% certainty. We don't have mathematical certainty. But we have as much certainty as is given to human beings that this seems to be the way forward. And then we go with that. But that, of course, the hunch is the product of much thinking, discussing, praying, and then we give it our best shot, because that's all we can do. But we shouldn't leave out any of the steps.
Next question.
Thank you for what you said about the Lexia. I did notice that when you introduced it, you suggested that the vicar might say you need to pray before you've got a million things to do. When are we going to get time to do this? But you then said you need to spend at least 15 minutes at it. I'm just wondering how we can encourage people to start off on the process of Lexia when they are very busy. This takes time for them to discover the benefits.
Okay. In fact, I think it's a really important point. There is an issue for all of us about all sorts of things about time management. And people say, I haven't got time. Absolutely right. I think the verb to have is not the great verb. I think we must the verb to make. We don't have time, we make time. And what is it worth making time for? If we think that something is important, whether it's learning the piano or getting fit, we make the time. What I was trying to say is that I think we can discourage ourselves with the praying bit at the beginning. I think if we do need to make some time for Lectio, because there isn't a way of doing it unless we make the time. But what I am suggesting is that if we do that, it's amazing how energizing that can be for perhaps making then some time for prayer. It is a very, I want to say this, it's a very energizing thing. Because if you take a physiological analogy, it's the equivalent of breathing in. And we all know that we can't breathe out unless we breathe in. We know that physiologically, but by golly, psychologically, we can try to breathe out without ever taking a breath. And then, of course, we hyperventilate and pass out and all of this sort of stuff. So, I speak from experience. I think that the time made, if you do 15 minutes of this, is time extremely well spent, because I don't know what it does, it gets in there, it does something. The Jesuits have found a really good wheeze, I'll call it a Jesuit wheeze, and this is the pray as you go, because they've noticed that thousands of people spend lots of time with iPods and things stuck in their ears. So you're going on the tube and there they are. They think, well, okay, if you're going to listen to anything, why not listen to something really nourishing? So pray as you go is something you can download from a computer. It's, I think, about 10 mins on a daily basis, which you can listen to on your iPod as you travel the Circle Line or whatever. And something is going in, because that's very clever by the Jesuits. Very, very clever. It's eminently doable. They're making use of the technology, making certain the devil hasn't got the best tunes, and they are actually feeding people's hearts and giving them the wherewithal to move. So I agree, you can't have anything without making time. It's the old time management issue. But I would say to do this is a really, really good starting point, because then we find that we do actually have something to say to God. Because the other way around, if I make time to pray, I come there and I feel like a block of wood. There isn't a single thought in my head, apart from, my back hurts. I'm yawning my head off, whatever it is. And it's awful, really. It's awful. So it gives me the wherewithal to have the conversation, because God is always saying something fascinating. I can have a fascinating conversation, but He's got to start it. He's got to start it. I am not fascinating. God is fascinating.
Do you have anything to say to us about angels?
Oh, yes, I do. Oh, yes, I do. They used not to play much part in my spiritual life, but I have warmed enormously to angels, because they come in various shapes and sizes. I was always taught, and I believe this, that they are heavenly beings, and we don't know much about them. Heavenly beings, pure spirits, that's what the theology book would say, and how are they used in Scripture? They are used, I used to think they're just used for messengers, because the word angelos in Greek means a messenger, so typically the angel Gabriel is the classic example, was sent by God to deliver a message. Okay. But then I began to be aware that that's not the whole story, because in Scripture there's the whole tradition of an angel being somebody who walks beside. And of course the whole book of Tobit is about a person going from A to Z and getting there because he has somebody by his side. So I thought, angels, not just messengers, but people who accompany. Now, and also I noticed in St. Luke's Gospel, in today's feast of St. Luke, he's the one evangelist who says that in the Garden of Eden, not the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane, beg his pardon, in that terrible agony, there was an angel that appeared to him, comforting him. The angel wasn't actually saying anything, but he was there making it possible for Christ to endure this hideous moment. So that whole thing about an angel being somebody who says a word, but also somebody who accompanies. And then, in my thinking, okay, there could be heavenly beings who operate like that, but for the moment just being more incarnational. I think back to those people who in my life, have said a word, whether they knew they were saying it or not, which made a big difference. What they said made a big difference. Now, either I can think, well, that was a complete chance and coincidence, or I can think, being incarnational, I think that was meant. They were being an angel to me. They were doing the delivering of a message. And then I think of people who didn't particularly deliver a message like a sentence, but were there beside. And I think, if they hadn't been beside, then what would have happened? So then I think, angels, heavenly beings, but angels, human beings. And I think that is absolutely consonant with the God who really, really cares and who walks beside us in these very earthly forms. Because you don't notice, in a sense, you don't notice these people until they've been, which is one of the giveaways about God. You don't see him coming, and you don't see him there. But once he's gone, you think, wow, it's just like the road to Emmaus. That made a difference. So I hugely believe in angels, and the heavenly ones, but the earthly ones, because this business of God wishing to be beside us, and he's just going to do it in very earthly terms. Otherwise, one's going to have to discount what people say and whether they're present or whether they're absent, which surely is nonsense. That must be nonsense. It must be nonsense. And by the way, the word talking about friends, there's a lovely thing in Scripture which just says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend," somewhere in the book of Proverbs, meaning a friend who, on occasion, will say something which is quite punchy, which is not immediately music to the ears, but he or she is saying that because he or she cares so much that she's going to say this thing, which I need to hear, and that's going to make a big difference. The critic who speaks lovingly, speaking the truth in love, says St. Paul. That too is delivering a word. And word from St. Benedict, he's got a chapter there on the poor old bursar. The bursar means the procurator, the guy who has to worry about the money and the radiators of bust and the contractors and all that stuff. And nobody goes and sees the bursar unless they want something. And they never rush into his office and say, what a fantastic job you're doing. You just don't do that. They're always complaining or groaning or wanting something. So St. Benedict says the very key job, he says, it can happen that somebody comes along and you can't actually offer them anything. The bursar can't offer anything, haven't got the solution, we haven't got the spare parts, da-da-da-da. He says, if that happens, then at least you ought to offer them a kindly word. And then he quotes from Scripture, because a good word is above the best gift. It's a wonderful quotation from Scripture. A good word is above the best gift. And I think that business of being angelic is about offering good words to each other. And we think back about those people who said really good words, who saved us from some hideous stupidity we were bent on, or who have actually pointed us in a really good direction. And then those people who they didn't say anything, they were just there. They were there, they were there, they were there. Thank God they were there, because if not, then what? Does that help? Sorry, waxing a bit too eloquent there, but any good?
And one more question, then we'll let you go.
Okay. Now, he and I were at school together, so he may be about to launch some exercise.
What you have had to say has been very flexible and helpful in all sorts of different directions. For many people, the idea of the monastic life, and indeed it is in the rules of pension, is extremely routine. It's extremely time-managed. The day is set before you. Most days you have to live according to a rhythm, involving a lot of scripture listening, yes. But is there a connection between the rather set disciplinary rhythm of your life and the ability to become flexible, actually demonstrated so well, I think, in what you've had to say.
Got it. I hope this is an answer to your question. I hope I haven't misunderstood the question. I do think that what St. Benedict has in mind is something which is very routine, very structured, very repetitive, very iterative on the one hand, but on the other hand, very adventurous. So it's the old thing about being able to go deep, 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 precisely because one makes certain things routine. Now that means I think that a monk, well, at best, is going to be somebody who's a creature of habit in the sense of going round and round and round. But also, please God, will have voyaged into the inner world in a way which will enable him to be open to, flexible to, and so on. And I've seen that to my great delight in people who are very ancient mariners monastically, because they've been here for all these years and they've done all these things day after day. But they seem to have, for example, a tremendous, let's say, openness to a new idea, or a tremendous flexibility, or a tremendous ability to reach out from their great age to the very young. That sort of thing. And I do think that the two do go together, because the one makes the other possible. Not a very good analogy, but if certain things become really routine, take the thing of driving. I've driven up this morning from Worth, and I don't know what that is, 100 miles or something, and I must have changed gears a zillion times and pressed the clutch and blah, blah, blah. I never thought about those things, because I was looking at the road, and I needed not to think about these things so that I can look at the road. In the same way for St. Benedict, there needs to be a certain on auto, but not mindless auto, so that I can actually concentrate on what's very important, and from that I think flows, I hope at best, some really good life-giving energy. I hope. Where are we?
Just one or two things that I would like to add. For me, your talk spoke to me about letting our guard down and actually allowing people to come in without almost being surprised by God. He is a God of surprises, and that we can take risks. So that's what's happened for me. One of the things I'd like to point out to you is that there are some of these leaflets at the back which will show the rest of the series. Two other things. One is that we are intending to have we are intending to have a workshop on Exia Divina later on in the course. That has to be firmed up, but I will let you know. The other thing is that the dear monks at St. Benedict's have very generously invited us to be with them for a Gregorian chant Vespers on the 8th of November. I'm sure we can't all go because it's quite a small but do come. It'll be a wonderful experience. And finally, these talks are not without costs, and so if you felt able to make a donation, there are some bowls at the back. It's with no further ado, I must thank you for a very stimulating and fascinating talk. Thank you very much.